Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
And from listeners like you, who support us through Patreon. Bonus material, thank you gifts, and more await at patreon.com/I Hear of Sherlock.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you began.
Episode 269. Ben Abramson Speaks.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Hi, hello, and greetings, and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees, where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you ready to speak today?
I am ready to listen today, which is even more important than speaking, and it's such a commodity that's in such short supply. We need much more listening. And that's what I'm here to do. I'm here to relax, put on my smoking jacket. As soon as I get those cinders off the carpet and listen and speak a little, I suppose. Woof.
You know, you're like a child's toy where all I have to do is put a key in your back and wind you up and you're ready to go. It's admirable.
Oh, thank you. Well, that simple metaphor has turned into a lifelong philosophy for me, and it's one of the reasons why I have so many superficial relationships that don't last very long.
Oh, come on. A
little of me goes a long way.
A little dabble, do you? I understand. I'm reminded of an anecdote told to me by my late great friend, Dr. Larry Shields, Lawrence Thornton Shields, from back in Boston. He used to love going to receptions and openings and, a lot of different cultural events in Boston. And if afforded the opportunity to speak before the assembled guests, Larry would always grasp the opportunity. And Larry, the way Larry tells it, is his wife said that he would go to any opening, particularly if someone would allow him to speak. In fact, he would even go to the opening of a can of tuna fish, if so called. So, wise words from Larry Shields. Well, I think what we're about to embark on here, this is a different kind of interview that we'll do.
Oh, this is something I've really been looking forward to. I have to interrupt you and say, in the 16 years,
my goodness,
16 years, we've been doing this podcast. We've spoken to professors, we've spoken to producers, we've spoken to actors, designers, Stephen Moffat, Clive Merrison, Fritz Weaver, Ken Ludwig, authors, Nicholas Meyer, the whole Sherlockian panoply, Baker Street irregulars, executives, thinkers, academics. And in all that time, two people are noted because they have never responded to any of our invitations to be on this program.
Oh, remind me who they are.
Ben Abramson and Vincent Starrett. But today, one has agreed to interview the other, and I couldn't be more pleased.
Well, we have had former leaders of the BSI on here before, But this is really the first time we've been able to go into yesteryear, as it were. And this is going to be fun because this is from a recording from 1952, I believe. If that's...
I'm not going to argue with you.
1954. A 1954 broadcast from WMAQ. And it was actually... It's not Vincent Starrett. It's Martin Maloney, who was the interviewer here.
Oh, dear, oh, dear.
Interviewing
So Vincent
Ben.
still hasn't replied to us.
No, no, but we will try. And we will describe to you exactly how we came by this recording. But before we do that, we'll talk a little bit about Ben Abramson, the history of the Baker Street Journal, and his association with the BSI, as well as his role in the book-selling industry. And we'll even have another archival clip for you as well about some early memories of Ben. It's all part of episode 269 here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And if you'd like the show notes for this episode, they are available at ihose.co/ihose269. That's where you can find any links that we have, a description of the show, as well as the ability to sign up for email updates and to support us on Patreon. All of our Patreon supporters get the show ad-free. They also have an opportunity to review exclusive content, such as outtake shows. We actually have a few outtakes from this very show that we recorded just before kicking off. So, we are all about supporting our fans and giving them what they deserve, which is mediocre programming that doesn't make the full cut. And we also will have our regular canonical couplet quiz at the end of the show, where we ask you to identify which Sherlock Holmes story we're referring to from two simple lines of poetry. We have another fairly easy one this time around, and we will announce the winner of the previous episode's canonical couplet. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Well, this is interesting, Bert, because here we have an opportunity to give a biography and background of someone who will be appearing on the show, but who won't be joining us right after this bio. What do we know about Ben Abramson so far?
Well, we know a good deal about Ben Abramson, thanks to John Lellenberg's book, Irregular Proceedings of the Mid-40s, which is a part of his archival, the late John Lellenberg, part of John's archival history series about the BSI. We know that Ben was born in Lithuania in 1898. He came to America at the age of 5. And so again, here you've got someone who was 20 or 30. Well, he was, when Conan Doyle died in 1930, Ben Abramson was 32 years old. So had a lot of experience in the stories of Sherlock Holmes being first on the market when he was of reading age. Bookshops were his high school and university. Beginning in 1917, he spent 2 years as a clerk at a bookshop in Chicago and became acquainted with the rare books department at A.C. McClurg's. He acquired a lifelong love of rare first and deluxe editions. And then in 1923, he struck out on his own. He opened the Argus Bookshop to cater to new and out-of-print markets in Chicago.
That is astounding because when you think about it, he was only 25 years old. 25 years old, and he opened his own bookshop. That's brave.
Well, it is brave, and thankfully he didn't wait 6 years for 1929. This was in the pre-depression, pre-stock market crash years when there was a lot of opportunity and growth, particularly in Chicago with that early literary life in the 20s, which I think we've talked about, or I've certainly written about that in the past, about that community. People like Ben Hackett in Chicago, Vincent Starrett, of course, all the people around the great newspapers in Chicago, overlooking that lake in Michigan Avenue. And that's where the Argus bookshop was. And of course, in those days, Christopher Morley was working for Harper Brothers, I think, and it was speculated that Argus might have been a place where Vincent Starrett met Morley for the first time, because that was sort of magnet for Morley to go to a rare bookshop like that.
Yeah, and we know a good deal about Ben Abramson and his work thanks to fellow Chicagoan Vincent Starrett. In 1940, Abramson moved Argus to that Michigan Ave location, and Starrett recalled the bookshop as a gathering place for book lovers and local writers and visiting celebrities back when Chicago, of course, was at the nation's crossroad thanks to railways. And Starrett recounted this in his book, Born in a Bookshop, which is, by the way, a lovely volume. And we spoke with Starrett expert Ray Betzner in episode 61. That's probably another companion episode that pairs well with this one.
Yeah, very good.
So we come along to the Depression, as you referred to before there, Bert, and obviously this hurt business for Ben locally in the early 1930s, and he started turning to mail order, which, I mean, when you think about it, bookstores up until that time were largely about personal visits. They supported the local inhabitants, or perhaps travelers that were coming through. As I said, Chicago being the nation at the nation's crossroads. But here, Ben Abramson set his sights a little wider, knowing that some of the things that he collected might be of interest to collectors and book lovers across the country.
Well, and as you, I think, mentioned earlier, Ben, of course, moved the Argus bookshop to New York, to West 46th Street. And but before we get to West 46th Street, just in terms of Chicago and that community, Ben was interested in Sherlock Holmes. And of course, because he dated back to that newspaper community in the 1920s, he was a friend of Vincent Starrett. And he was interested in Holmes. But he was not one of the four founders of the Hounds of the Baskerville, sick, in 1943. But he found his way to their dinner very promptly, and he was one of the 12 people at their first state dinner in January 1944. So now he moves to New York, where he already knew Morley, Starrett, and wrote to... Starrett wrote to Edgar Smith recommending that he and Abramson get acquainted, and they met and they talked. And out of that, there in the early 1940s, that early introduction from Starrett to Ben Abramson and Edgar Smith, Smith and Abramson conceived of the Baker Street Journal.
It's a lovely story, really, and it is actually bound up in what I mentioned before in Ben Abramson's mail order catalog. Because, I mean, usually when you think about a mail order catalog, you think a little pamphlet, a few columns. People can put a check mark next to it, return the slip with their check or with their promise to pay, and that's it. But Abramson, when he produced his catalogs, this was really his first foray into publishing. And some of them, believe it or not, ran to 130 pages. And it was sort of a running monologue, as Publishers Weekly wrote after his death, and enthusiastically dictated causerie about books, new and old, titles appearing in caps throughout the text with prices mentioned along with other comment. And his business flourished when he did this in the early 1930s. So by the end of 1936, Abramson had actually created a regular publication called Reading and Collecting, which was specifically aimed at bookmen. And it had articles and reviews by Abramson, and others. In fact, P.M. Stone from the Speckled Band of Boston contributed, and it was really the forerunner of the Baker Street Journal, and I think it lasted about 15 or 16 issues before going belly up, which was also a forerunner of the Baker Street Journal experience. A kind of foreshadowing in terms of Ben's enthusiasm not matching with Ben's understanding of the market, which would be his fatal downfall, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, we don't really know very much about how the decision to launch the Baker Street Journal on a quarterly basis was actually made. You know, your reference there to a sense of the market. I mean, something like this was really guesswork. But apparently by the middle of September in 1945, Smith and Abramson had figured it out, and Ben Abramson's daughter wrote a memoir in the 1970s. And according to her report, Ben, Morley, Edgar Smith, and Paul McFarlane, a talented book illustrator and puppeteer, who all had offices near 3 West 46th Street, which is where the Argus bookshop was, decided they would like to start a magazine for Sherlock Holmes devotees. And at first, there was some doubt about how much material might be available from papers written by the Scion organizations, the affiliated groups around the country. So Ben wrote to, some of those various groups and rounded up all the material, read at their meetings and went over it with Edgar, and they decided it would be worthwhile to start. And Edgar would be the editor and Ben would be the publisher. And, they began it with a $5 annual subscription. 1945.
That is something. And this is where we run into, the history of the BSJ. It was lavishly produced. If you've ever seen any of these, what are now called old series Baker Street journals, they are thick magazines, some running to about 132 pages. Again, reminiscent of Ben's catalogs there. But they are wonderfully illustrated, designed, laid out, again, thanks to Paul McFarlane as the designer. And McFarlane actually went on to support some of the other BSI projects, including the Blue Carbuncle, which I believe was published in 1948. There was an essay from Morley, as well as the story itself, and blue-colored plates of the Paget illustrations laid in that version. And McFarlane actually did the design there as well. So you've got this lavishly produced volume, and I believe, from what I understand, the print run of these was around 3,000, which is extraordinary for the time. And this was produced, again, in 4 quarterly volumes in 1946, 1947, 1948, and then only 1 issue in 1949. So there are missing 3 quarters, as it were, in 1949 in volume 4. And according to our sources in the Irregular Proceedings of the Mid-40s by John Lellenberg, when the BSJ, had the demand for the BSJ met the very considerable supply that he arranged for, it would not only have paid its own way, it would have paid very handsomely. Instead, the response was a disappointment to the BSI and a disaster for Abramson. Despite publicity and inducements, some of them controversial as far as the regulars were concerned, it seems that subscriptions never rose even close to the break-even point. When the BSJ finally failed, leaving 3 of the 1949 issues unpublished, Abramson was unable to refund subscribers. And Ben was the way some irregulars responded was as if Ben had absconded with the funds, but that was not the case. He was simply broke, and his daughter, again Deborah Covington, estimated that he had lost $15,000 on the Baker Street Journal, and this was back when average American incomes were about $3,000 a year.
Yeah.
So
big
it was
money.
a sad, big money, but a sad end. It might be interesting at this point to hear someone who met Ben around this time at the Argus Bookshop and was an early subscriber to the Baker Street Journal. We need to dip into our archives here and call upon none other than Peter Blau, who we interviewed back in episodes 6 and 7 about his Sherlockian experience, and he recounts meeting Ben Abramson for the first time and the impact that Ben had on him.
And beyond that, as I explained in the Baker Street Journal, I don't know what my first meeting with Sherlock Holmes was, but my first really important meeting was with a Sherlockian. That was Ben Abramson, the publisher of the Baker Street Journal. And that got me into corresponding with people and eventually getting answers back from them, which is one of the things I thought was wonderful about the Sherlockian world. People didn't care that I was a callow youth and just a teenager. They'd answer the letters. Look at me now.
And Abramson where Ben was then in New York?
Ben was in New York City. He'd moved, he'd moved from Chicago. He brought the Argus Bookshop from Chicago during the war. And at the end of the war, my father was going down to New York on business and took me along because he wanted to meet Ben Abramson. He'd always done business with him by mail. So we went to Ben's Argus Bookshop in New York, and he was very nice to me, and he greeted me that I should go find a book I wanted to read. I had a wonderful time. It's the first time I'd ever been in a bookshop. Bookstores, yes, but never in a bookshop. And I got to climb up and down the shelves and look at all sorts of interesting books. And I finally found the book I want to read and brought it up to him. And he looked at it and said, the collected poems and stories of Fitzjames O'Brien. I said, yeah. And he said, why do you want to read it? And I said, well, I read 2 of the stories in a book at school, and I thought they were fun, so I want to read some more. And Ben said, that's the best reason to want to read a book. Your father's going to buy the book. And my father flipped open the book and looked at the price, which was $28.50. Well, in those days, you could buy a suit and a pair of pants for $28.50. And he said, and Ben said, it's a first edition. And my father said, Peter doesn't need any first editions. And Ben said, Alan, everybody needs first editions. Buy him the book. And I still got it. It's over on the shelf across the room. I like to do show and tell if I'm standing up near the bookshelf. And Ben would, every 3 or 4 months, write me a letter and say, Dear Peter, I'm sending you a package of books you will enjoy reading. Tell your father to send me $10. And he was always right. I always enjoyed reading the books, and my father always sent him the $10. And in 1948, Ben wrote a letter and said, Dear Peter, I publish a magazine you will enjoy reading. Tell your father to send me $10. And it was the Baker Street Journal.
Well, as you can tell from the archival quality of that clip, that was Peter on vinyl, back when we used to issue the episodes here on vinyl LPs. I hope our audio quality has improved a little bit since then. Yeah. But how marvelous to hear from Peter firsthand about Ben.
Yeah. Oh, it's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. But
Yeah.
you get so in that wonderful anecdote, and Peter has a limitless store of wonderful anecdotes. What you get there is the attitude. You get the feeling of being in the bookshop, and you get the feeling of Ben Abramson's personality. Alan, everybody needs first editions. Buy him the book.
Exactly. Well, and this tracks with what we see in Lellenberg's recounting here, that Ben was a born salesman, a talkative, expansive man who loved books and had a Rabelaisian appetite for life. And that really comes off in his interaction there with Peter and Peter's father. Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the BSJ, and more importantly, we will line Ben up to speak to us. Stay tuned.
The Sherlock Holmes Review is back, with articles on Sherlockian film and television, classic canonical scholarship, detective stories, illustrators, collecting, and more. In the latest annual, Curtis Armstrong tells how his love of Sherlock Holmes and acting first came together, how he starred in his first radio series, The Baker Street Theater, while he was still in high school, his encounter with Sherlock Holmes, Hugh Laurie, and Lin-Manuel Miranda, when he featured in the TV series House, how Sherlock Holmes crossed into his character in the WB series Supernatural, and his role as Inspector Gregson in the audible drama Moriarty, The Devil's Game. The Sherlock Holmes Review is back, combining great design with great writing, welcoming fans of every age and attitude. Get the latest issue, the 2022 annual, at wesexpress.com today.
Okay, we're back in the midst of our episode about Ben Abramson here, the first publisher of the Baker Street Journal. Now, we mentioned the kind of the demise of the BSJ. This was partially due to Ben's business acumen, or lack thereof, when it came to the Sherlockian world. But also, he was having some personal struggles, and I think it's worth discussing this because it does color what we know about Ben and his experience. That he was diabetic, and he didn't really follow the appropriate health regimen of a diabetic at the time. And as early as 1945, we're told he was regularly hospitalized for treatment. And in late 1947, he actually suffered a nervous breakdown. And according to Lellenberg, it was brought on by loneliness, alcohol, and business problems. And when he went into the hospital, his business went into decline. And in April 1949, again, this would be concurrent with the demise of the BSJ, he closed up the Argus bookshop on West 46th Street, and he moved upstate to Mohegan Lake, New York, just a short throw from Peekskill. And he ran his business out of his home then, so it became entirely mail order. And it was a quieter life in the countryside. It was an opportunity to improve his health, but he continued to drink. And his financial problems did not improve, unfortunately.
Well, and you would expect that they would not. Yeah, sadly, it's more complicated too than diet. Sadly, in the 1950s, there's just been extraordinary strides in managing diabetes, and the therapies that we're familiar with today didn't really exist in the same fashion back in the 1950s.
Yeah. Well, the good news is he returned to Chicago in 1953, and I know Starrett was probably excited about this. His return was announced in the Tribune on March 29th of 1953, and he reopened the Argus bookshop there. But in the 8th floor rooms in the old A.C. McClurg building on South Wabash, where he had learned the whole rare book trade in 1919. And he told the antiquarian bookman The 9 years' exile now seems but the wink of an eye. The interval is virtually erased, and I feel now as if I had never been away. But it wasn't quite the same. His health continued its decline. He was in debt. The IRS was after him for back taxes, and finally he passed away on July 16th, 1955. So, a sad and unfortunate end for Ben Abramson. But we do have a glimmer of light during this time. As you mentioned before, Bert, we have an interview that Ben Abramson did in 1954 with Martin Maloney at the School of Speech at Northwestern University. And it was picked up from a broadcast on WMAQ on the long-running series Americana. And this episode was titled Mr. Sherlock Holmes in America. And Martin Maloney brought a hand recorder to the event and eventually loaned a copy of the recording to Ben's daughter, Deborah Covington. And it was pressed as a mono recording on red vinyl by United Film and Recording Studios in Chicago.
See, now, if only we'd known about red vinyl, we could have taken those early iHose episodes and they'd be stacked up in jukeboxes all across the country.
I thought red vinyl was the name of my bookie.
Red vinyl.
But this is our opportunity to hear what Ben actually sounded like. And our chance to bring Ben back to life, if just for a bit. This was about a little over a year before his passing. And it was about a year since he had returned to Chicago. So it was his opportunity to talk about his love of Sherlock Holmes, his interest, his knowledge, as well as the Baker Street Irregulars. So hang on to your seats, folks. We'll have this quick interview with Ben Abramson.
This is a recording made from a tape of the broadcast given on March 1st, 1954, of Martin Maloney's Northwestern University series. The broadcast is in progress, and Mr. Maloney has just asked Ben Abramson how the Baker Street Irregulars came into existence.
It came into existence through the fact that the Baker Street Irregulars had come into existence. That was in 1934, when certain devotees of Sherlock Holmes, and particularly Christopher Morley, thought that the devotees of Holmes might join in an informal sodality, or even whiskey and sodality. And they held their first meeting at the Murray Hill Hotel. Present were Alexander Wolcott, Elmer Davis, Frank and Christopher Morley, and 2 or 3 others. It was decided that there was enough Sherlock Holmes lore to justify the organization and to set up archives. Then in 1944, when I moved to New York, I decided that the archive should have a more permanent form than being in a box deposited in the Cox and Company's bank, which, as you remember, was the place where Dr. Watson kept the Holmes memorabilia.
Yes, of course, so that the quarterly actually contains then the remains of the doctor's notes.
Yes, and also it contains the studies and investigations of Sherlockians concerning discrepancies in the narratives, and also investigations as to the chronology, the identity of characters, and so forth.
Well, tell me, were you ever able to publish Watson's notes on, let me see, it was the Cormorant, the Lighthouse Keeper, and something else?
That was not published, although some of the mentioned but unrecorded adventures have been published in his journal.
I take it then that the main purpose of the Baker Street Irregulars is to investigate the Holmes canon.
in much the same way that the Kipling Society or the Dickensian Society investigates the works, the activities of their respective subjects. So the Baker Street Irregulars are devoted to a study and investigation of the adventures of Sherlock Holmes as narrated in most cases, in fact in 57 out of the 60, by Dr. Watson. The three remaining adventures, two were written by Holmes himself and one by his brother Mycroft.
You were one of the original members of the Irregulars, I think, weren't you?
No, I wasn't, because I was in Chicago then. But when a Chicago Science Society was formed, I immediately joined and was one of the founders of the Hounds Sick of the Baskerville.
You have a title, I think.
Yes, I am in the National Society, the Beryl Coronet, which is 11th in scholarship of Holmesiana. Mr. Vincent Starrett of Chicago is the studying scarlet. He is number 1. Dr. S.C. Roberts of Oxford is the sign of the poor, number 2. Christopher Morley is a scandal in Bohemia, number 3. And Mr. Edgar Smith, the president of General Motors overseas, is number 4.
Which is?
The Noble Bachelor.
What goes on at your meetings?
Usually, papers are read on some particular aspect of the Holmesian adventure, as, for example, the number of times that Dr. Watson was married, or the number of places, or what place he was wounded.
That's a serious question, I take it.
Oh, yes, indeed, and is investigated by many medical men. A specialist in the field usually reads a paper on the subject. In the case of the speckled band, the question arose as to whether or not the same snake that bit the daughter bit also the stepfather. It seemed unreasonable because she had been in convulsions for several hours before she died, while he died instantly. And so Dr. Rolf Boswell of City College, New York, in conjunction with the famous herpetologist Dr. Dittmars, investigated and concluded that it was a more venomous snake in the second instance. But to the contrary, Dr. Rolf Boswell, Dr. Anthony Boucher stated that it wasn't a different snake, it was the same snake, and that Dr. Rylat had died not of the venom, but of a heart failure.
Very good. Has anyone ever really decided where Watson was shot?
No, it hasn't been established, because on one occasion he speaks of his leg being very painful because of the wound, on another occasion his shoulder. And while a good many theories have been established, it is thought that he was shot in that portion of his anatomy which he felt it indiscreet to describe, and so he shifted it somewhat to the leg.
Oh my, that's this all sounds perfectly wonderful. You have rules and regulations in the Irregulars?
Oh yes, indeed. There are in fact a set of bylaws that were drawn up by Mr. Christopher Morley. An annual meeting shall be held on January 6th or thereabouts, at which canonical toast shall be drunk to the woman, who is Irene Adler, to Mrs. Hudson, who is the landlady, to Mycroft, who is Holmes' brother, and to Dr. Watson's second wife, after which the members shall drink at will. The current round shall be bought by any member who fails to identify, by title of story and context, any quotation from the sacred writings submitted by any other member. Qualification A. If 2 or more members fail to so identify, a round shall be bought by each of those so failing. Qualification B. If the submitter of the quotation upon challenge fails to identify it correctly, he shall buy the round. Special meetings may be called at any time or any place by any one of 3 members, 2 of whom shall constitute a quorum. All other business shall be left for a monthly meeting. And finally, there shall be no monthly meeting.
Sounds like a wonderful society to belong to.
Yes, it is. Members derive many advantages by being able to listen to these learned disquisitions on various phases of Holmes' adventures, of his personal life, of where he went to college, whether at Oxford or at Cambridge, and of many other aspects of his life that Dr. Watson never fully revealed.
You told me once that in your capacity as bookseller, you had made a remarkable discovery concerning the books that was in The Adventure of the Empty House, was it not?
Yes.
In which Holmes surprises Watson in the character of a bookseller?
Yes. Holmes had prepared himself to be able to enter Dr. Watson's house without Watson evincing any surprise. And so, representing himself to be a bookseller, he carried under his arms a number of books, which Dr. Watson names. Among them were Buick's Beige Birds and an edition of Catullus, published in 1749. It had been suggested by one of the irregulars that Dr. Catullus was the vascular one, issued in 1749. But that is a folio, and its very size would have tended to make it difficult for Holmes to drop the books in the manner in which he did drop them. And I discovered that there's a London edition of 1749 of Catullus, a duodecimal, small enough so he could easily push it out from under his arm and thus cause the rest of the books to fall down.
I think you discovered the actual copy, did you not?
Yes, I did. It's a small book bound in red leather, and it contains the bookplate of Oliver Wendell Holmes. Holmes had visited America 2 years after the death of his kinsman, and he saw the son, who later became United States Justice of the United States Supreme Court. As a token of his visit, as a memento, the junior Holmes gave Sherlock a copy of this Catullus, bearing his father's bookplate. Later, Holmes used the book, and in falling, its binding was broken, and later when Watson acquired it, he mended the binding with surgical tape. And this is the very copy right in front of you.
Sounds like a book buyer's dream.
Yes, it does, but many things are discovered that might seem to be forever hidden. For example, the case of the playlet written by William Gillette called The Painful Predicament of Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Vincent Starrett, Christopher Morley, and other Holmesians had for more than 30 years searched for the text of this play. When Gillette made his farewell appearance in Sherlock Holmes in the 20s, Starrett asked him for a copy of the text, but since Gillette had no speaking part in that, he couldn't remember it, and was thus thought to be lost as Sappho's poems are lost.
You have now recovered that, I think you said.
Yes, I have. I had made no effort to do so until everyone else had given up in despair. And then I, using the methods of the master, managed to find the text.
You're not prepared to reveal those methods until you republish the playlet, however.
Well, the playlet will be republished very soon, and therefore I can reveal the manner in which it was discovered. Using the master's methods, I concluded that anything, no matter how improbable, must be the case if any other alternative is impossible. And so I decided to look into what improbable circumstance might exist. And that was, then I discovered that in England, every play must be submitted to the Lord Chamberlain for a reading before it can be performed. Moreover, the Lord Chamberlain retains the copy so that when the performances are given, it can be checked against the text to see that there were no alterations made between the time that the Lord Chamberlain read it and the time that it was produced.
And you were able to get that copy, I take it?
I wrote to the Lord Chamberlain's office and asked for a copy of the text, and they forthwith dispatched to me a typewritten copy of that text. And
wonderful.
It will be ready, available for sale within a few weeks.
Let me ask you a question that perhaps I shouldn't put to you, Ben. Do you encounter laymen in your profession, that is, not scholars of the life of Holmes and Watson, who take these stories as seriously as do the members of the Baker Street Irregulars?
Oh yes, a great many people believe that Sherlock Holmes was a real person, and of course the Baker Street Irregulars must believe that.
They're based on it.
Yes.
You encounter this sort of person in the book-selling business, I take it?
Oh yes, very often, and in fact, often well-informed people. It's true not only in America, but all over the world. During the First World War, when the British landed in France, some of the French generals asked if they had brought along Sherlock Holmes to help in doing Secret Service work.
I trust they had.
Yes, indeed they had, and that probably, and also American aid, was responsible for the Allied victory.
I've been very much interested in the existence of the Baker Street Irregulars, and I've often wondered why, in your opinion, does this kind of a society exist? That is, here are a great many busy and extremely distinguished men who spend a tremendous amount of time at this sort of avocation, pastime, whatever you want to call it. Why do they do it then?
I think, in a sense, it is an expression of freedom. That seems to be a rather tall description for what many consider a small subject, and yet it isn't true. When I first began to publish the Baker Street Journal, one man, seeing it, said to me, "How dreadful for you to waste paper and time and ink in publishing this useless thing when the world is confronted by such tremendous problems as the paper shortage." And I said, very well, the next issue will have content similar in kind to the present issue, but I'll print on the front cover, "This magazine is full of social significance." The reason is deeply that the right of men and women to act as they please, provided they hurt nobody else in the process, and nobody is hurt by the researches of these men in Louisiana, just as nobody is hurt by the researches in the work of Kipling or of Dickens or of Scott or other writers or characters. Sherlock Holmes has become so real to so many that this illusion of believing him to be a real person, it gives a chance for men to exercise their wits, for men to investigate, for men to apply logic, and develops the mental faculties of people in other directions.
Why do you suppose people chance to pick on Sherlock Holmes instead of, say, Doyle's other character, the Brigadier Gerard?
Possibly because Holmes represents intellectuality, possibly because he represents logic, and possibly because of a kind of impersonal attitude. He is so serene, so above things. Passion is engendered by his listening to music rather than by women. The things which men are excited by usually do not excite him. He transcends that, and so therefore becomes a character that is looked up to.
Time did not permit further discussion of the Baker Street Irregulars. These final remarks on the popularity of Sherlock Holmes concluded the broadcast.
Well, there you have it from 1954. The answer, which is that the study of Sherlock Holmes is freedom in action. And that's I like that little libertarian sense there from Ben.
Yeah, I mean, an expression of freedom. It's our freedom to think as we do. And, I mean, look, Sherlock Holmes himself was a free thinker. Was unique in the annals of crime, as he himself says it, and marched to the beat of his own drummer. And so do we Sherlockians, whether we belong to a group as large or as historic as the Baker Street Irregulars, or perhaps as near and close as a Zoom call with other Sherlockians. It's really just about having fun with each other and playing the game. Hey, I hear you over there. You must be scratching your head wondering what's new with our friends at MX Publishing. Well, let me tell you, if you don't go to their website often, it is worth a visit, because I can tell you just this summer we've had a number of publications like The Recollections of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Hall, Sherlock Holmes, A Question of Time by Glenn Searfoss, Sherlock Holmes, A Study in Illustrations, Volume 4 by Mike Foy, and Oscar Slater, A Killer Exposed by Brenda Rossini. But coming up, there are at least 5 books that are going to be released in September, as well as, another 6 or 7 in October. Everything from Nessie's Nemesis, Sherlock's Secretary, Book 2 by Chris Chan, Sherlock Holmes, Tales of Darkness by Paul D. Gilbert, Sherlock Holmes and a Tale of Greed by Daniel D. Victor, Sherlock Holmes, The Devil's Disciples by Richard Ryan, A Study in Statecraft by Orlando Pearson, and many, many more. Just get over to mxpublishing.com and check out their new books to see exactly what fits your appetite today. Hey, guess what? That's right. It's everybody's favorite Sherlockian quiz show. It's Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry and ask you to identify the Sherlock Holmes story for a prize. Well, if you remember, the last time we were around these parts, we gave you this clue. When noble dukes such doubtful aims pursue, they cause a mercenary point of view. Bert, do you know which story we're talking about?
Yes. That is the case where burglars break a water pipe when they burrow into a bank vault. It's the case Watson called The Adventure of the Slick Simoleons.
No, I'm sorry, Bert. You weren't even close on this one. I can't tell you. Yeah. Well, as usual, our friend Eric Deckers came to the rescue.
Thank goodness.
He said, I've got it, or at least I think I've got it. This was a little hard in the end. It's the story of Dr. Thornycroft Huxtable and his insatiable love for jalapeno-flavored pudding pops. He has a particularly distressing morning after eating nearly a dozen of the spicy treats. It's the adventure of the fiery stool. Oh, boy. And Eric admits that it may be a little too lowbrow, even for our audience. More likely to be the adventure of the Priory School. Yes, that's right, Eric. We're looking for the Priory School. So, I'll tell you what, why don't we pull out our giant spinning wheel and give it a big spin. Watch it go around. And eventually landing on number 25. Number 25, and it looks like that is Christine Taylor. Christine, congratulations. We will have a prize from the iHose vaults heading just your way next time around. And now we will give you this episode's canonical couplet. Here we go. To see a genius in his tracks arrested, just whisper Norbury as he requested. If you know the answer to this canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. And our prize this time around for the astute listener who happens to win will be one of Ben Abramson's published Baker Street journals. That's right, one of the old series of the BSJ, which we will pull from the iHose vaults here. So it's your chance to get your hands on a lavishly published and designed Baker Street journal in its original form. Well, Bert, I think it's about time we return to our original forms. I should say before we leave, we ought to give a little acknowledgement to a couple of recent passings in the Sherlockian world. Within a week of each other, 2 icons from the musical Baker Street passed away. Jerome Coopersmith, who wrote the book, and Inga Swenson, who appeared as Irene Adler and was actually nominated for a Tony Award for leading actress in a musical. Both passed away this final week of July 2023. It's worth noting that we interviewed Fritz Weaver, who starred as Sherlock Holmes in that musical, back on episode 26, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Long time ago.
Yes, a long time ago. We will have a link to that in the show notes as well. Did you ever get a chance to see Baker Street the musical?
No, I didn't. I mean, I was living in New York at the time, but we never got to the show. But in those days, I took the record album out of the library and just loved the record album. Then eventually I bought the record album and then just loved the music and thought they did some very clever things, taking the pattern of Holmes's speech and putting it in that Singspiel motif that, as Fritz pointed out, Rex Harrison employed when he was Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. I just thought that was very clever and effective. Although, it's a sad show in that nobody connected to it. Fritz or Hal Prince were particularly happy with the outcome. They felt there was something sort of off with the book. And then, a big aspect of that was the puppet work by Bill Baird's puppets. There was that was part of the recreation, I think, of London and the Diamond Jubilee, and that kind of thing makes it very difficult for a show like that to travel. You can't really put it on in different theaters, different local theaters around the country. So, but it's a great score, really.
Yeah, I mean, ironically, the musical won a Tony for Best Scenic Design. And, so lavish was it, as you say, that it was difficult to take on the road. But you can still enjoy it today. Find a copy online, either purchase an LP. I think there may be a CD version of it.
Oh, yeah, it's on CD. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's well
very
worth it.
Worthwhile.
Yeah. And make sure you check out episode 26 of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, which is a musical stroll down Baker Street. Wonderful discussion there. And I think we even have some clips from the musical as well. Well, that kind of wraps things up for us here. It's been marvelous reviving Ben Abramson from the dead. And hopefully we haven't put too many people into a coma. And this is the moderately attentive Scott Monty.
And this is, dozing as always, Burt Wolder.
And together we say, The game's afoot.
Afoot.
The game's afoot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.